The Christmas Mystery by Jostein Gaarder. The 18th of December. Papa hadn't liked Joachim opening the magic advent calendar before he and Mama got up. On the 18th of December, it was he who woke Joachim. That day there was a picture of a rod with a shining gold ball on one end. "That's a scepter," explained Mama. "Kings and emperors have used rods like that as a symbol of dignity. The round ball is probably meant to be the sun." Joachim unfolded the little piece of paper that had fallen out of the calendar and read aloud to Mama and Papa. They sat on each side of him on his bed. The Emperor Augustus. A strange procession swept through Thrace towards Constantinople on their way to Bethlehem. 500 years had passed since Jesus was born in a stable, swaddled in a piece of cloth and placed in a manger, because there was no room for Mary and Joseph in the inn. But that old story was already familiar in large areas of the world. They stopped in front of one of the city gates that was guarded by soldiers. The soldiers drew their swords and raised their spears as soon as the first sheep reached the gate. Then the angel Seraphiel flew up beside the sheep and placed himself between them and the soldiers. "Be not afraid," he said. "We are on our way to Bethlehem to pay homage to the Christ child. You must allow us to pass." The soldiers dropped their weapons and threw themselves on the ground. One of them signaled that they could pass through the city gate. Soon all the pilgrims were inside the solid city walls. It was early in the morning, and the city was not yet awake. The procession of pilgrims stopped on a hill with a good view of the harbour and the Bosphorus, which divides Europe from Asia. The sound was so narrow that they could see across to the other side. "The time is 4:95, said Epheriel. "Originally the city was called Byzantium, but in the year of our Lord 330 it was made the capital of the Roman Empire by the Emperor Constantine. First he called the city New Rome, but it was soon given the name Constantinople. After that, the city took back the old Greek name Byzantium. In just under 1,000 years, in 1453, the city will be conquered by the Turks, and they will give it the name Istanbul." Had the soldiers heard about Jesus? Elizabeth wanted to know. "We can take that for granted. The Emperor Constantine made Christianity a lawful religion in the Roman Empire as early as 313. He was baptized himself just before he died. Some years later, in 380, Christianity became the state religion throughout the Roman Empire." "How do you manage to remember all the dates?" asked Elisabet. "I only have to follow the angel watch," replied Epheriel. "Since we don't have to bother about all those seconds, minutes, hours and days, it's not so difficult to remember the years. Another date we must notice is the year 395, exactly 100 years ago. That was when the Roman Empire was divided and Constantinople became the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The angel Seraphiel came up. He pointed at a beautiful church. "That church is called a basilica," he said, "and was built in honor of God's wisdom by the Emperor Constantine. In a few years it will be destroyed by fire, but on the same spot the lovely Santa Sophia Church will be built. It will stand as a landmark for centuries." "We must get across the Bosphorus," said Quirinius. "Then it's not very far to Syria. Dixie." Joshua thumped his shepherd's crook on the ground. "To Bethlehem, to Bethlehem." They ran down through the city and before long were standing on the furthest point of the Golden Horn. At the edge of the quay they were met by a magnificent man in colourful clothes and with a glittering sceptre in his hand. In the other hand he was holding a thick book. Imperial was already airborne in order to say, "Fear not," but the handsome man took no notice of the cherub. He came straight towards them. "I am the Emperor Augustus, and I shall accompany you across the Bosphorus. I order you to accept this gesture without any unpleasant protests." He showed them a boat with several large sails. The sheep had already begun to jump on board. "Then you are one of us," said Epheriel. Elisabet turned to the angel and said, "I didn't know the Emperor Augustus was a Christian." A mysterious smile passed over the angel's face. "But the old Roman emperor has been taking part in the Christmas gospel as a kind of stowaway for many centuries. And God's kingdom is open to everyone, even people who travel without a ticket." Elisabet thought the angel's words made heaven even bigger than she had imagined. She hid what he had said in her heart. Soon the large company were over on the other side of the Bosphorus. As they landed, Elisabet greeted the Roman emperor and asked what kind of book he had under his arm. She thought he was going to say it was the Bible, or at any rate a hymn book, for heaven could surely demand this much of an old emperor who had suddenly decided to go along with them to Bethlehem. But the Emperor Augustus said, "It is the sacred census." He said no more. He was so handsome and so proud that he clearly did not like talking for too long at a time, at any rate, not to little girls. Elisabet thought it was a bit odd, for it surely didn't happen every day that a Roman emperor was able to greet a girl who had run off after a lamb, who had escaped from a store in Norway and headed for Bethlehem. Joshua struck the ground with his crook and reminded them where they were going. But they hadn't run very far before they stopped on a hill above the town of Chalcedon. The town was teeming with priests. They were like a swarm of bees. Elisabet was astonished, in fact almost scared, to see so many priests at once. "Fear not," said the angel Seraphiel. "The time is 451 years after the birth of Christ, and the biggest conference in the history of the Christian Church is being held down there. The town is called Chalcedon, and priests and bishops from the whole of the Christian world have poured in." "What are they talking about?" Elisabet wanted to know. The angel laughed. "They're trying to reach agreement about correct Christian doctrine." "Are they going to agree?" "After long discussions, they'll finally make a declaration that says that Jesus was both God and man. And they're discussing a great deal else as well. Some of them are so eager to find out what is the correct belief that in their haste they forget what is most important." "And what's that?" asked Elisabet. "That Jesus came into the world to teach people to be kind to one another. No other lesson is more difficult for a human being to learn, or more important. It's not as important to know how many angels there are in heaven, or whether God has a splinter in his little finger." "Has he really got one?" "It doesn't matter. I told you, it's more important to see the beam in your own eye." Elisabet found that very difficult to understand, but she hid the angel's words in her heart. Perhaps she would understand them better another time. The two wise men were clearly not entirely satisfied with what the angel had said. "It is, strictly speaking, not necessary to believe in angels at all," said Caspar. "Many people believe that such concepts have very little to do with what Jesus wished to teach us." "The angel stories may only be fairy stories," added Balthasar. "But that Jesus wished to teach humans to be kind to one another was no fairy story. Only now did Epheriel begin to argue. "We angels are not used to using such strong words," he said in a gentle voice. "All the same, I must say that this is one of the silliest things I've ever heard, at least on this pilgrimage. You should be ashamed of yourselves, both of you. Or you should stay in the Orient and not start wandering westwards with such irresponsible talk. Yes, indeed," added Imperial. "You should be ashamed of yourselves, both of you. I'm offended." The next moment, Imperial did something Elisabet thought angels in heaven would never do. He put his hand in front of his offended face and thumbed his nose at the two wise men from the Orient. "Bar to you," said the cherub. "Yes, indeed." A certain nervousness began to spread among the godly company. The angel Seraphiel unfolded his arms to show he was not carrying any weapons. It's easy to lose courage when even your nearest and dearest lose faith in you. But although we can disagree about such important matters of belief, we mustn't under any circumstances begin to quarrel. Now let's try to forget the unkind things that have been said and the unkindness that was thumbed. Joshua the shepherd was clearly in agreement with the last speaker, for now he thumped his crook on the ground and said, "To Bethlehem, to Bethlehem." And with that they started moving down through Phrygia. Joachim sighed heavily and let the piece of paper fall into his lap. "It's silly when grown-ups quarrel," he said. "But it's even sillier when the angels in heaven start quarrelling." Papa nodded. "These have always been sensitive matters. It's not the first time people have got cross because of a discussion about angels." "But they didn't disagree so very much," protested Mamma. "The angels and the wise men agreed that the most important lesson Jesus wanted to teach people was that we ought to be kind to one another. And that can, in fact, be much more difficult than believing in angels." Papa opened the atlas and pointed out Constantinople, which is called Istanbul today. Also the narrow Bosphorus Strait, where the Emperor Augustus had taken them across by boat. In the pancake book, he found the old city of Chalcedon, where all the priests had met in order to discuss what Christian doctrine was. Now the pilgrims had arrived in Asia. When Mamma came home from work that afternoon, she had a large envelope full of newspaper articles. She had been to the library to get copies of everything that had been written in the newspapers when Elisabet Hansen disappeared in 1948. The family sat round the coffee table, reading the old newspaper cuttings. They examined the picture of Elisabet Hansen carefully. Mamma took down the photo of the grown-up Elisabet from the mantelpiece and began to compare the pictures. Could the two pictures be of one and the same Elisabet? "Both of them have fair hair," said Mamma. "And I think they've both got a slightly pointed nose, too." "Impossible to tell," snorted Papa. He was more interested in the disappearance. As he read the old newspapers, he said, "Her mother was a teacher. Her father was a well-known journalist. Only her little knitted hat was found when the snow melted a few months later in some woodland. Otherwise, the police have no clues at all." "They hadn't read the magic advent calendar," said Joachim. "Even if they had, they couldn't have arrested an angel," laughed Papa. After Joachim went to bed later that night and Mamma and Papa had said good night, he put the light on again. It occurred to him that he hadn't looked at the large picture on the outside of the advent calendar for several days. That was because most of the doors in the calendar had been opened, so he closed them. Then it happened again. The picture showed Mary and Joseph leaning over the baby Jesus in the manger. In the background were the wise men and the angels descending through the clouds to tell the shepherds in the fields that Jesus was born. High up on the left side there was a picture of two men in fine clothes. Unlike all the others, they were standing with their backs to the scene. Joachim had seen them before, and now he was quite certain that they were supposed to be Quirinius and the Emperor Augustus. But only at this moment did he notice that the emperor was carrying a shining scepter. Had he been holding a scepter in his hand ever since Joachim was given the magic advent calendar in the little bookshop? Or had the scepter drawn itself in?